So till now, we have completed 2 hours and 30 minutes of our video, but I have yet not discussed why MVC and why MVC is better than WebForms. And I have purposely done it. Why? Because when you need to compare two things, then you should know both of the things. You should have some kind of experience on both of the things to make a fair comparison. So at this moment, because you have seen the 2 hours 30 minutes of the MVC video, so you have an idea of MVC, and also because you have worked with ASP.NET Web Forms behind code, you have an idea of Web Forms as well. So at this moment, this is the right time, I should compare MVC so that you can understand better. But before I jump into the comparison, let us try to understand a bit of history of Microsoft, because there is a lot of connection of the MVC revolution and the way Microsoft has started. So if we go back to 80s, where we had DOS operating system. So if you remember, in those 80s, we had our DOS operating system, which was a black window like this. And if people want to go and create a file or search a folder or do something, they have to type those cryptic commands. So for example, if I want to go and see a directory, I'll say dir, right? So people were using this DOS commands, people were using this operating system, and suddenly Microsoft launched Windows, where people started seeing those start buttons, menus, they started seeing the folders, and you don't have to write those cryptic commands. And Windows operating system became the most used operating system. Everybody installed Windows operating system into their home, and Microsoft was a successful company. So the success of Microsoft started by the word visual, right? So by using that thought process visual, so if an end user is able to see things visually, if he's able to click by the mouse visually, that's what attracts people. So the success of Microsoft was visual, visual, and visual. So there is a saying which says that once a person gets success by one thing, right, he tries to use the same thing again and again to get success in other things, right? So Microsoft wanted to take the same visual success story into programming. At that time, there were a lot of languages like COBOL, C++, DBase, so these languages, they did not have any kind of visual editors. So if somebody wants to create a button in C++, he has to actually write a code for it. So what Microsoft did, they ventured into something called as visual programming or RAD programming. RAD. RAD stands for Rapid Application Development. So they said that, how about, rather than developers writing these codes for creating a button, for creating a window, how about we give them a toolbox like this? How about developer can see actually these buttons and drag and drop here? And then when he drags and drops here, so for example, he should be able to see a button like this. He drags and drops, he double clicks on it, and there is a code behind. He starts coding, it starts delivering, right? So rather than getting into nitty-gritties of how to create a button and how to create a form, right? How about we give developer this taste of visual programming and RAD programming? And that's where they launched Visual Studio. And again, in programming language world, Microsoft got success. So I remember at that time we had something called as Power Builder. Power Builder was completely replaced by VB, Visual Basic. We had something called as DBase. Visual Fox Pro almost killed it. It's almost not there anymore now. We had C++. People started using VC++ because of the visual interface. So what Microsoft did is, for each one of these languages, where developers were struggling inside those cryptic editors, he started giving such kind of a Visual Studio IDE. IDE stands for Integrated Development Environment, where developers can drag and drop buttons, write code, deliver faster, right? And again, Microsoft got success. Okay, so the Visual Studio, which was launched at that time, almost, it killed all the languages at that time. Whatever good languages were there or big languages were there, they were almost replaced in the Windows operating system. So C++ was replaced by Visual C++, Power Builder was replaced by VB6, and etc. But later on, new problems started for Microsoft. Because of this so-called the visual interface, they ended up creating a lot of compilers. There was a C++ compiler, Visual C++ compiler, there was a VB6 compiler, there was a Fox Pro compiler, and it was becoming difficult for Microsoft to maintain each one of these compilers separately. So they thought about creating one big umbrella, that is .NET. So they said that, okay, all of you guys, keep your coding style with you, but at the end of the day, when you hit the compile button, when you hit the build button, you will compile into one platform, and that is .NET. But bringing them into one platform, .NET, was not a challenge. The challenge was that they were habituated to RAD programming. They were habituated to visual programming. So they were habituated to those toolboxes, those behind code, those property windows, etc. So what Microsoft did is, in order to take this developer crowd and not lose them, they continued impressing the developers with more RAD code, more RAD components, and the same they applied for ASP.NET Web Forms. So if you look at this ASP.NET developer environment, it is completely RAD. Okay, in other words, it's completely visual programming. For example, you can see that I have dragged and dropped this button here, and at the back end, right, in the behind code, you can see that he has created the button class here, the button object. Okay, in the same way, if I click on this button, he opens up an event for me. So this ASP.NET environment, what we have here is completely RAD. As soon as we drag and drop some components here, it creates an object at the back end. When we double click on it, it creates an event, and etc. Now this RAD programming is great, but it leads to some other issues. The issue is behind code. So in other words, when developers drag and drop these components, the code is generated in the behind code in partial classes, right? Now automation has its own benefit and it has its own issues. The biggest benefit of automation definitely is that the projects are delivered faster. But the drawback of this automation or of this behind code, it has led to a very weird and an inappropriate architecture. So let us first discuss about why this behind code or this RAD programming or this visual programming has led to a weird architecture. So problem number one, view-based architecture delivered for an action-based requirement. A good architecture should satisfy requirements in an appropriate manner. Now ASP.NET web applications are used to create websites, and if you watch closely, websites are used by end users in a request response way. In other words, it is action based, means end user sends actions, and depending on action, response is sent to the end user. Also, if you look at the HTTP protocol, which is created for websites or for web applications, they are action oriented. Like, they have words like post, get, put, delete. Now for this kind of action based requirement, Microsoft gave a view based architecture. So in other words, for example, let's say that you have this simple page here called as product.aspx, let's say, and this product.aspx has let's say an action here called as buy product. Let's say there is some button here which has logic to buy products. So there's a buy product method. Okay, now if you see what happens here, right, the following things happen. So basically, let's say that your application is running, your site is running. So now you can see the end user is on your site, and he initiates the action. Okay, he initiates action by clicking on this buy product. So the time he clicks on this buy product here, what happens at the back end is the page life cycle gets kicked off. So you can see the first thing is what has happened is when I clicked on this action, it sent a request to that view product.aspx, and the product.aspx kicked off a behind code which has a complicated page life cycle. So what happens is, first thing, the complete page load, page init, and what other kind of life cycle gets run, the events are run, and then finally this button click event, which is having the buy product method, the logic that gets executed. Now this is complicated, right? Means what should have happened is, when I click on this buy product, it should actually go and execute this method straightforward. Why it has to run a complicated page life cycle? And let's say if I have one more thing here, let's say sell product, again it goes and runs this complicated life cycle, and then finally goes and executes that logic in the button click. So what was happening here is, when the action was sent from the end user, it was going to a view, and the view was running a complicated page life cycle, and then finally somewhere down the line he was going and executing that action. But then if you closely watch, this architecture is actually hitting around the bush. In other words, to reach the necessary action logic, you have to go through a complicated page life cycle. So the logical approach would be to hit the action directly. That means once the user sends an action request, it should actually map to a method inside a program. The method gets invoked, it runs all the necessary logic for the action, and then it invokes the view. And that's what exactly happens in a MVC project. So for example, you can see over here in the same project, where I have my simple web form, I have created an MVC application. So in MVC application, what happens is the first hit comes to an action. So for example, you can see here, I have an action here called as buy product, right? So if I go and run this, so now if the end user comes and initiates a buy product action, now remember this buy product action can be initiated from a button. At this moment, I'm initiating it from a URL, right? So if I go and initiate this action, you can see the first thing what happens is the direct hit comes to the action, to a method. It does not go through any kind of a complicated page life cycle. And the best part is once it hits the action, it executes the necessary logic. At this moment, I don't have any logic, but I can always go and put a lot of C# code here, which does all the necessary things which is needed to ensure that the buy page is seen properly, right? And after this, he goes and he invokes this buy.aspx or buy.whatever view, and it displays it. So now that is more logical, right? Rather than going and executing a complicated page life cycle and then coming to the actual action, the logical approach is hit the action directly, execute it, and then go and display the view. So the first problem with the web form approach is that for an action based requirement, a view based architecture is selected, which is actually quite wrong. So now the base on which you are standing goes wrong, then a lot of things starts going wrong, right? So the connected problem, because of this bad architecture selection, was that the behind code was not reusable. The code behind, which was generated from the RAD tool was not reusable. So what do I mean by reusable? Now think about a scenario that, if an end user logs in from his normal desktop computer and he initiates this action buy product, then you would like to show him a simple buy view. But what if he initiates this action from a mobile? Then probably you would like to show him a buy mobile.aspx, right? So in other words, depending on your action, you would like to show him different views. So for example, I would like to do something like this. I would like to say string device type, right? So I would like to say like this: if the device type is equal to desktop, then you just say return buy, or else you say return buy mobile, right? So in other words, depending on scenarios, he either sees a buy view, right, or either he sees a buy mobile view. Now this is very much possible in MVC because the hit is now directly coming to the action, so you can easily make a choice where you want to go. But if you are supposed to do this in your web form application, think about it. It's very difficult, right? Why? Because there is a complete page life cycle which gets initiated. So probably you would like to do something like this. Then if depending on the mobile, you would like to, depending on the device type, you would like to do a response or redirect to must be product.aspx, or you would like to do a respond or redirect to a mobile.aspx. So in other words, it's a kind of a workaround, but not how do you say, not a proper way of implementing things. But if you look at MVC, now here, because the hit is coming directly to the action, I have a full chance, or I have the full control of saying that, okay, now go to this view or go to that view. So the next thing is the behind code, in ASP.NET Web Forms is not reusable. But here, in the controller, if we move the behind code, then we can reuse it. Why? Because depending on scenarios, you can go to this view or you can go to that view. So also what it means is that, the controller has the behind code actually. So in other words, whatever logic you are writing in those button click events of the page life cycle, those logic you are going to write now in the action result over here. So with that, you can reuse the same action logic with one view and also the same action logic with other view depending on situations. So we talked about two big things here. First one, the choice of the architecture was wrong. The requirement is more of an action oriented thing, but a view based architecture was fit into it. Due to that, the second big problem was that the behind code which was generated for the RAD is completely now not reusable. In other words, I cannot use that code behind with different kinds of views. But in case of MVC, because the first hit comes to the action, I can make a choice of reusing that code with one view as well as with other view. Now problem number 3, HTML is not the only response type. A lot of people think that, when you talk about web application, they should always give out HTML. And yes, that's the case 90% times must be. But there are cases, where the output needs to be sent in XML format. Or probably let's say that if your web application is communicating with languages like JavaScript, then probably you'd like to send JSON. In other words, you'd like to invoke an action, but that action can have different kind of response type depending on situation. For example, here I can say that, okay, if the device type is desktop, you send by. If the device type is mobile, you send this, or else, so I'll say else if something like this, else if device type is mobile, you send mobile. But let's say, if the call is coming neither from mobile or neither from a user and desktop, so must be you'd like to return here a JSON result, because if it is not an end user, then probably it's some program like JavaScript calling, right? So you'd like to send JSON. Now you can see over here in MVC, I can have different types of result sets here. You can see that we have something called as action result. So depending on scenario, I can send him HTML, some kind of a view like this, or if I want, I can send him some kind of a JSON object if I wish, right? But if you were to do this in your ASP.NET behind code, that means in your web form, it is very difficult. Why? Because if you look at the web form thing, so if you just go back to your web form, here, the first hit comes to the view, and what the view does is it actually goes and initiates this page life cycle, and finally at the render and the pre-render event, HTML is created. So here in the behind code or in the web form, the output type by default is HTML, and if you ever want to change it, then you have to go through all those things. You have to say your response.content type is JSON must be, and then you will say response.end. You get into a lot of complications and hacks, right? So again, the third problem, which actually MVC addresses is that you can have different kind of response types depending on the client. So if it's a simple end user, you send him HTML. If it is JavaScript, you send him JSON. If it is someone else, probably you will send him XML. This is not possible with ASP.NET Web Forms. It is possible, but you have to do a lot of hacks like response.content type and response.end, etc. Problem number 4, flexible combination of view and data. Now, when an end user sends a request, right, to a website, the response, what the end user gets, right, it's nothing but it's a combination of view, that means some kind of HTML or must be some kind of structure, and data which comes from a model or a business layer. Now web form is a view first architecture, so already the view has been decided, right? But in case of MVC, what happens is, because the first hit comes to the action, he can always go and pick up any kind of model and attach with the view and give a different response type. So in other words, that flexibility of combining the data with the view is possible with MVC, but it is not possible with a web form. Why? Because in web form, the view is already fixed because the first hit comes to the view. So when view is already fixed, right, he cannot make a permutation or combination of himself. You can do it, you can put a lot of flags and do a lot of things, but that would make the page very complex. So in MVC, I can do something like this. I can say, okay, for example, here you can see that depending on situations, I'm going towards depending on situation, I'm displaying a buy page, or depending on situation, I'm displaying a buy mobile page. Now in case I have a model here, so normally you go and add model to this models folder here. So let's say I go and add a model here, So model is a simple class at the end of the day. So if I go and add a model here, let's say a customer model. Now what I can always do is I can do the following here. Okay, I'm not putting anything at this moment in the customer class, but assume that there is customer code and customer name, those kind of things. So what I can do here is I can create the object of the customer class, fill it with some data by querying the data access layer and those things, right? So I can do the following. So I can take this customer object and I can bind it with buy.aspx, or in other situation I can take the same customer object and bind it to buymobile.aspx. So you can see now, we are able to make a permutation and combination of the view and data. This is very difficult, when it comes to web forms. Why? Because in web forms the view is already fixed, and the final problem with web form is testing. If I ever want to go and test this behind code, for example, if I ever want to go and invoke this button_click event, it is very difficult. But what I can do now is what I can do for the MVC project is I can go and create a very simple unit test like this. So you can see that I have a very simple unit test here called as test project 1, which actually references my MVC application. And over here I can go and create the object of my controller straightforward. So I can go and create the object of my controller like this, and then I can always go and invoke actions, right? And I can test the output of these actions. So in other words, I can test my behind code actually. But in case of my web forms, it was very difficult to invoke the behind code because the behind code was tightly coupled with the user interface. But in our case now, that means in the MVC case, this controller is a simple class. So we can always go and create the object of the class wherever we want, invoke it and test it. So the final thing, what MVC provides us is a very nice unit testing approach, to test our project. Right. So in other words, summarizing, there are 5 big things, which MVC solves around the problems of web form. So let me revise those points, before I end this video. Point number 1, the requirement is action based. Web is an action based requirement, but for that, we have chosen a view based requirement. Why? Because Microsoft wanted to keep the RAD thing, and to keep the RAD thing means the first hit has to come to the view. The second problem we discussed was reusability. There was a tight coupling between the behind code and the view, so we were not able to reuse that code with different views, right? For example, if you remember, I said that in MVC I can go and invoke different kinds of views under different kinds of scenarios, which was not possible in ASP.NET web forms. The third thing was HTML is not the only content type, or is not the only display what an end user wants. Depending on situations, he would like to get XML, he would like to get JSON. So he would like to go and run the same action logic, but he wants a different kind of a view, right? So that is very much possible in MVC, because at the end of the day, we can go and return different kind of views like view result, JSON result, and at the end of the day we have this common abstract class here called as action result, which can help us do the polymorphism at the back end. Fourth one, we said that at the end of the day, when we say that we are giving a response to the end user, it is a combination of view and data. So in MVC we can always go and take whatever data we want and combine that data with whatever view we want. So the permutations, we can have multiple permutations and combinations between the view and the data. And the final one, the final two things, because the controller has become a simple class now, I can always go and invoke that class and do unit testing on it. So to solve these 5 problems, we need to use MVC. So in other words, you can see that here's a diagram, and I have also shown what things we have to change in order to implement the MVC architecture. So you can see at the top, this line here indicates our normal web form architecture. So basically we have our ASPX file, the ASPX code, and the ASPX code is further divided into two parts. One is HTML and the other one is a behind code. So this guy actually goes and calls the middle layer, which has the business logic, and the business logic further calls the data access layer, which will connect to our SQL server or to our RDBMS, right? So the basic problem was, in the web application was that the first hit was coming to the view. So what we have done is we have taken this behind code and we have made it as a controller with a lot of actions inside it. So what will happen now is the first hit will come to the controller. We have taken this view, and the view we have moved behind the controller. So in other words, this behind code, which was the problem, right? We have moved it into the controller class, which is lightweight, which can be reused wherever we wish, right? And rather than sticking to that view based architecture, we have now chosen our action based architecture. So in other words, the first hit comes to the action picks up the view, and then we have a model here. This model is nothing but your middle layer, which was already there in your 3-layer architecture in web application, and the model calls the data access layer. So we have done the following changes. First thing, we have moved the behind code into a controller, further segregated into actions. When you go and hit this action, it actually goes and invokes the view. The middle layer from here has been changed to a simple class, which is a model. So in other words, we have taken this as it is, and further we have our data access layer here. So with MVC now, we have an action oriented architecture, okay, or we have an action based architecture. So the request first comes to the controller routes it to the appropriate action picks up a model, creates an object of it. So for example, if it is a buy product, probably he'll go and create an object of a product class, takes up a view called as product.aspx, ties up with that view and sends the result as a HTML or JSON type, depending on what the end user's device is or what the end user requirement is as a result. So we have covered 2 hours of a training, and 14 hours is still pending to become a nice MVC professional, and I'm guaranteeing that you will become. And these 30 minutes of this video was very important. I know that it was a theoretical video, but I wanted to make sure that you understand why MVC, because what I've seen is that a lot of people who are from the web form background, when they start learning MVC, they start getting suspicious, saying that, oh, it's going to take so much time. Oh, I don't have the server controls. Oh, there is no view state. Oh, there is no page lifecycle. Why? But remember that the main goal of MVC is to take that code behind, which is a problem, which is generated due to the RAD development, and move it to the controller and make it reusable, make it lightweight, make it more flexible, etc. So one thing we have to register in our mind is we are not going to get server controls, and that is for our good, because we'll have a lot of control on HTML. We'll have a lot of control on our project. So if that thing is communicated, then MVC would be more fun to learn. So I wanted to ensure that in this 30 minutes of video, that thing is communicated to you guys, and I hope so I've done it. So we have more 14 hours pending. Don't lose heart. In case you are not understanding any topic, mail us at questmod@questmod.com. Call us on these numbers. In case if there is no technical person picking up the phone, must be there is some other person. Send him a message saying that, I have this problem, my subscriber ID is this, please help me out, and we will help you out. So let's try to complete the remaining 14 hours as soon as possible. Thank you so much.